So here we go. And we're going to be asking ourselves whether or not the Constitution created a democracy. Okay, so created this type of government where it's government by everyone. Okay, so before we answer this question, I want to ask you guys, and I want you to very quickly type it into your response here in chat. Is the United States a democracy? I'll give you a couple seconds to answer yes or no. Is the United States a democracy? So Marcia has responded yes and no. Ashton says a form of democracy. Marion Singh says yes, question mark. She's not very sure about that. And just to clarify, you guys can see, all you see is the screen. You don't see anything in my background, right? On the screen there, you just see the Constitution with a little thing on the side there. Hopefully it's what you see. I lost my little green little screen there. Yeah, okay, good, excellent. Okay, so a form of democracy, Dana agrees with Ashton, it's a form of democracy. So I'll ask you this, what part of the United States, what part of our government do you think is democratic? I'll ask you that. So we seem to be under both a democracy and a republic, says Marcia. Okay, I agree with Marcia on that. So what part of our government do you think would be considered democracy, and what part would be considered something different? You guys have any ideas about that? The right to vote is a democracy. Okay, excellent. And we know that it's kind of limited still, because we know that when we can vote, we have to be 18 years of age, right? So that's a 20th century development. We have to be 18 years of age to vote. So being able to vote is part of the democracy. And then who do we directly elect? When we, as a nation, we'll talk about on a national level, who do we directly elect to be our representatives, or to be, or anything? Who do we directly vote for? House of Representatives, okay. Congress, excellent. It's a House of Representatives being part of Congress, so the Senate and the House of Representatives, okay. Is there anyone else we directly vote? Local, state, and city. Very good, Marcia. So that's more of a state constitution kind of system, right? But is there anyone else that we vote for? And this is kind of a tricky one. We have an election coming up, sheriffs, okay? So that can be the form. But if we look at our national government, we all vote for the president, right? Now we cast our ballot for the president. And we'll talk about this a little bit on how this develops over time. But one of the questions we often have is, how democratic are we, especially when we're trying to spread democracy or spread liberty. Now, we often hear talk about the original intent of the writers of the Constitution, but the Founding Fathers did not plan to create a political system we have today, what we call a democratic republic based on two national and permanent political parties. So a lot of people might say democracy is also the fact that we have a democratic part of the government, and or Democrats and Republicans. Some might say that two parties is part of the democratic process. But when we consider democracy today, our Founding Fathers would have seen something very different. Indeed, democracy and political parties were dirty words to them. They did realize, however, that the world was likely to change, which is one reason they included an amendment process in the Constitution that has allowed this document to survive as our frame of government for so long. Now, the Constitution was not the original frame of government of the newly independent United States. Now, the states were originally governed by the Second Continental Congress, and then from 1781 to 1789 by the Articles of Confederation. Okay, So we didn't really get our constitution until a lot longer. After 1783, we become independent, completely independent, and a new nation. And prior to the ending of the American Revolutionary War until 1789, we were actually governed by a separate set of rules, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. Now, late 19th century historians saw these articles as a disastrous failure, engendering the critical period concept in which the infant and endangered United States was saved by the godlike founding fathers. So they're going to tear apart the Articles of Confederation and say that if it weren't for these great founding fathers, we were in a critical period, we needed their help. That interpretation was questioned by early 20th century historians who argued that the Constitution was the response of moderates protecting their own economic and class interests. And in this view, the Constitution was an anti-democratic, counter-revolutionary document. Now, in turn, that interpretation came under attack in the mid and late 20th century. Many historians today view the Constitution as a continuation, not an antithesis, of the Revolution. So some say that the Constitution saved the American Republic. Some say that, the creation of the Constitution created an anti-democratic system. And some view, including myself, view it as a continuation of revolution. But the idea that we're going to continue changing and amending and moving forward is a main part of the revolution. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Articles of Confederation, so our first system of government. Now, the process of creating governments began in the 1770s as the colonial assemblies transformed themselves into state legislatures and governments. Now, this process would involve a rejection of the British concept of balanced government in favor of overwhelming legislative power and a move from unwritten to written constitutions. Okay. Now, at first, the central government was the Second Continental Congress. The Articles of Confederation meant to serve as a bridge between the Congress and the federal government, and were presented to the states in 1777, but not ratified by all until 1781, largely because the states retained their distrust of both centralized power and one another. And we learned about in the lectures that I had you watch last week about this idea that each state was different and each state had its own way of doing things. And it wasn't until they had some common attacker that they decided to work together. Now, the article set up a central government of sorts, but a weak one, with no executive or judiciary, no power to tax or enact any important measures without a 2/3 vote, and no power to change the structure without anonymity. Everyone had to agree, 100%. Each state had one vote and thus a virtual veto power. So if every state wanted to change something, if they wanted to change something to the government, every state would have to vote, and if anyone disagreed, nothing would happen. Now, this organization was established very consciously. The states saw themselves as independent republics, retaining sovereignty and joining into a loose confederation, something like the United Nations. They feared centralized power, and they sought to guarantee their liberty through decentralization and state legislatures. Now, again, this is because this is what people feared. People feared centralized power. They saw what was happening back in Great Britain. They saw what it was doing to the tax structure in the colonies. They understood that the reason this is a problem is because the government is trying to take away our liberties and our freedom. So when the Articles of Confederation went into play, they saw, well, we know that the king is in control, so we're going to limit the power of the executive, and we're going to give lots of power to Congress, lots of power to lawmakers, because they're the ones that are going to do something about it. And the courts will be there, but we won't really focus too much on it. Now, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of 19th century historians saw this as a very weak form of government, but there were some things that were successful. Despite the inherent weaknesses of this frame of government, much was accomplished under the Articles, including the winning of independence and a favorable peace treaty in 1783, with the western boundary for the United States all the way to the Mississippi River. Pretty successful. Now, state governments were also established under the Articles, with many social and political reforms, including the extension of the franchise or the extension of the vote, frequent elections, and the separation of church and state. The pattern for Western expansion and establishment of further territories with also included were found under the Articles and in the Northwest Ordinances of 1784, 1785, and 1787. And internationally, the Articles opened trade with European powers and Asia. So lots of great things, even though they were very restricted in what they could do, the Articles were very successful in some ways. Now, this is an example of the Western land claims. So we know that let me go ahead and turn this on right here. Let's see. Draw. Okay, so we know that this is the boundary. Oh, it's green, not a very good color. Let's change the color here. We know that the boundary of the United States was this line right here. So here's my red line. So here's where the United States kind of was in that area. And then we extended, those were the colonies were, and then we extended all the way to the Mississippi River. And we got all this land here in between, right? All this land in between here. Now, one of the things that we had to later figure out is, does Virginia expand all the way to this area? Or does North Carolina extend all the way to this area, et cetera? And a lot of this is one of the problems that we're going to be facing further on. And what the Northwest Ordinances and all these ordinances said, well, we can set up territories in this land to the west, right? So this is some of the successes of some of the successes of the Articles of Confederation. However, there were some problems. Oops, let's erase that. Turn the annotations off. Excuse me, guys, while I quickly let's see, erase all of these things. There you go. Erase. Oh, there you go. There were some problems with the Articles of Confederation. By 1787, these problems started to outweigh the successes. The Confederate Congress had no power to tax, and thus to pay for military force or pay its debts. The nation's military power rested essentially with untrained and unreliable state militias. And this translated into a lack of power in foreign affairs and a lack of respect from European nations. So this bickering between the two and the inability for Congress to raise money. Now, following the war, which is a very common thing that occurs after a war, depression hit and was also blamed on the Articles. To halt land foreclosures, states began to repudiate debts and print paper money, causing inflation. And such measures were easy to enact because there was little or no check on legislative powers in the states. Some states established their own currencies and trading systems, causing a breakdown in interstate relations and presenting the danger that states would turn to European allies for intervention. So you can imagine, if we're living in the United States today, what would happen if one state decided to completely change its money. It would be very difficult for us to travel across the country if every state decided to do this. And one of the reasons that doesn't happen is because today we have a little stronger central government that mints money for the nation. Now, another thing that occurred in shortly after the writing of the Constitution, or the signing of the Articles, was what was known as Shays' Rebellion. Now, this is a march of about 1,200 men on the Supreme Court in Massachusetts and on an arsenal, and fear of anarchy began to spread. Now, the problem was that no national army was available to halt the rebellion, And although the state militia did, it could just have easily failed from lack of training or even joined the revolt. So there was no way to raise funds, and there was no way to to form a military to counteract this rebellion. Now, these problems convinced many that the national government was incapable of defending the liberty won during the revolution, and that a new frame of government was necessary. Note that the definition of liberty here was not democracy, but individual freedom from tyranny, either from above or below. So again, here the definition of liberty is not the ability to do as you wish, but the ability to be free from tyranny, either from the tyranny of the king at the top or the mob below. Now, the revolution, as we had talked about and as you saw in the lectures, had fought successfully for liberty and against tyranny from above, but the threat now seemed to be tyranny from below, mob rule, as shown in Shays' rebellion. Now, with the danger of European intervention and the possible destruction of the Republican experiment, tyranny from above had not been eliminated either. So there were some problems that the articles had faced. Now, to alleviate these problems, in 1787, a special convention was called to revise and strengthen the Articles of Confederation. Revolutionary leaders, including Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, were present, but aside from these two, most of the delegates were quite young. Many were veterans of Washington's Continental Army or the Continental Congress, which gave them a national as opposed to a state outlook. Okay, so before we had mentioned they were always talking about the states this, the states that, but now we're going to, these men that are coming to this new convention held in 1787 had a different mindset, one where they're focusing a little more on national issues. The representatives were both conservative and revolutionary. They were men of property who feared democracy and mob rules as destructive of liberty, but they were also revolutionaries who desired to create something new, a republic with centralized power to preserve rather than destroy liberty. And I'll repeat again that these men feared democracy. These were not men that were willing to form a complete democracy. And one thing to remember too is a lot of the enlightened thinkers of the 17th and 18th century also feared democracy. They thought people should be free to make their choices, but there's still a place for a powerful government. Now, their basic dilemma and goal was this: how do we create a government strong enough to preserve liberty from the tyranny of the mob or European monarchs, without giving it enough power to be tyrannical itself? So that's the question they had. How do we create a strong government, but keep it from being too strong? Now, in the 51st Federalist Paper, which was a series of papers that were written to argue for the creation of a national constitution and a national federal government, James Madison noted, he said, a dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government. Thus, the Constitution begins with we the people. Sovereignty rests with the people. Now, here's the problem, because it's important that we understand that it rests with the people. But it's also important to understand that Madison and others felt that, well, we don't want to give them too much power. We'll give them power. That's where the power of the government resides. But we won't give them too much power, and one reason was because a lot of these men feared the power of the mob. And in recent history, we've seen what happens when too many people get in one room, and we see what happens when they try to make changes in a more revolutionary and democratic form. Now, are there any questions so far? So we've talked about the Articles of Confederation, their strengths and their weaknesses, and the desire to create excuse me, a new form of government, one that is democratic, but at the same time not too democratic. So, is anyone surprised that this is the way that our founding fathers believed and thought, or do you think that this is all their plan from the beginning, or are any of you surprised that the founding fathers were afraid of democracy as we see it today? Any comments or questions? Does anyone know prior to the creation of the United States, what nations in Europe, if any, were democratic? Any ideas? Well, I'll give you a little bit of time to think about that. But let's talk about, so they were all monarchies. Excellent, Marcia. They were all monarchies. Well, there was one republic, the Roman Republic. Very good, Ashton. Okay, Roman Republic, and even before the Romans, we had the city of Athens, which is considered democratic. Um, there was one republic that was kind of a republic, not under the control of too many people, known as the Dutch. Very good, the Dutch Republic. 1619 is when they became an independent republic. And there was another one about 100 years later that developed, known as Switzerland. So Switzerland was another republican system. And in fact, today Switzerland is one of the few direct democratic nations where everyone votes directly for everything. There's no representatives. They vote for their presidents. They vote for their representatives. They vote for people. And they make decisions that way. A little bit different. So other than that nation of Switzerland today, which is a direct democracy, there really aren't any other direct democracies around the world today, because we are not a direct democracy. A direct democracy is one in which we vote directly for everything and we make all the decisions. So we're kind of a mix of a bunch of different forms of government, which may be a good thing considering how large we have become. But to our founding fathers, this was very important that we have the power to vote for certain things, but we don't want the people to have too much power. It's good they have power and think they have power, perhaps, but we don't want to give them too much. So how do we do this? Well, excuse me. The Constitution separates sovereignty, or the ability to rule, from rule via a series of intermediaries and divides power among those intermediaries to avoid tyranny. Now, we know the system as checks and balances, and it exists on two levels. This is important to note. It exists on two levels. Separation of powers among the three branches of the national government. So we have our national government, which included our executive, our legislative, and judiciary branch. So the separation of powers in that sense. And division of powers between the national government and the state governments. So I'll say that once again. So we have a separation of powers among the three branches of the national government and division of powers between the national government and the state governments. So let's see kind of how let's talk about an example of how this might work. So we have our National Congress over in Washington, D.C. They decide they want to pass a law. So they pass a law. They get all the House of Representatives, the Senate on board. They get this law kind of written up, and they decide to vote to pass. Now, what happens next is it goes to the president, and the president has the option to veto or sign the bill. Okay? If the president vetoes the bill, it's not over. It can go back to the House, and House and Congress, and they can overrule it if they have the right number of people. So that's an example of checks and balances. Now, the president could also make an executive order as the president of the United States. And if it is felt that he is outreaching his power as president, then the court systems, he can be sued by whoever decides to sue him, and the courts can make the decision. So another idea of separation of powers within the federal government. Now, if you look at the division of powers from the national government and the state governments, this is a little bit different. All the laws that are passed in Congress or written in the Constitution of the United States are federal laws. If the Constitution doesn't mention anything specific of what states can do, then states can make their own laws. So, for example, up until the 1960s in the United States, uh, each state could decide their own rules regarding marriage between different racial groups. And this is also rules of segregation in the United States because there was no federal ruling of whether or not we can do this or not. There was a court decision that we can separate and make things separate but equal. But it really wasn't until the 60s that this was really brought to the attention of both the federal government and individual states that there was this problem that was still occurring. But states had the right to do that until the federal government passed an act for things to happen. Okay, we have a question here from Marcia, but doesn't federal law supersede state and local law? That's a very good question. And yes and no. And the reason I say this is because a lot of the problems that exist in the United States today, especially dealing with law, ask this very question. Who has the power? Is it the federal government or the local state governments? And certain things, it's a very gray area on whether or not one is the other. One example that we often can look at here before you go on too much, we start talking about checks and balances, is the idea of immigration. Okay, so according to our federal constitution, it is the state, meaning the federal government, it is within their purview to define the borders and to define the rules of who can cross the borders. Okay, so that's the federal government's take on it. Now, some states in recent history have decided to pass their own laws regarding immigration rules. Most recently in Arizona, and then in the 1990s in California. And that law is perfectly legal. They're allowed to do that unless someone sues them. And in both these cases, the federal government did sue them. And then it was found that part of that law was unconstitutional, and they had to listen to what the federal government said. But there are lots of rules that aren't in our Constitution that states get to make their own decisions. Prior to the decision in 2015 regarding marriage of same-sex couples, it was the individual states' rights to decide what their own laws said regarding marriage. Okay, same thing with education. There are some rules that follow in that. Same thing with the buying and selling and growing of marijuana in more recent news. These are laws that states can pass, but unless the federal government has something to say about it, it could supersede. But there are some things that we can do. We try to make sure that the states and the local governments follow the federal law, but things can happen. Laws can be passed. It isn't until the court system might decide to step in to make any changes. So hopefully that answers your question. And the federal government, Marcia, and others in the class, can really only follow the law according to the Constitution. They can pass acts of Congress because the Constitution allows them to, but they have to do it in a certain way. So you're right, it does supersede state and local law, but the Constitution can also be changed as time goes by, and we'll talk about that a little bit here. So we have this separation of powers. Now, the founders returned to the concept of balanced government because of the perceived excesses and weaknesses of existing legislative governments. So I mentioned before, our balance of power is between our separate branches, so between our executive, legislative, and judicial system. Prior to the Constitution, we had a very strong legislative and a very weak judicial and executive. It was very difficult to do anything or for one to overrule another because one had all the power. So the founding fathers decided to combine elements of a monarchy, which may sound strange at first, but a monarchy, an aristocracy, and a democracy within the new national government. The president would be a monarch of sorts, indirectly elected via the electoral college by elite electors, which we would often refer to as the aristocracy, with a 4-year term and powers limited to those enumerated in Article 2. And I highly recommend taking a look at the Constitution and reading through the rules of what people can do. The Senate would be an aristocratic branch indirectly elected by the people through the state legislatures, which is different today, but this is how they envisioned it, with a 6-year term and the powers listed in Article 1. The national judiciary would also be aristocratic. The House of Representatives would be the Democratic branch, with short terms, albeit still with property qualifications for voting. So again, we have a president, which is similar to a monarch, although defined a little bit different later. A Senate, which is more aristocratic, meaning the elite, and the House, which is more democratic. So we have a combination of these three forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Now, as we know, each branch has the power to check the others. So for example, like I mentioned earlier, the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but Congress appropriates funds for the military and declares war. So the president's in charge of the military, but in order for him to have his military, Congress has to give funds for the military and declare war. Well, at first, the president can do something similar, but the Congress does it. The new national government had enormous powers, but it did not have a monopoly on power. The 10th Amendment explicitly reaffirmed that all powers not delegated or given or listed to the new national government or prohibited by it to the states would be reserved to the states, each capable of checking the other. So once again, the 10th Amendment says that here's our Constitution, this is what it says government can do. There's a list of things it says government can do. If it doesn't say it, then the states can do it. They can make their own laws accordingly. And then each state can check the power of another. So if one state decides to pass a law and the other one doesn't, that's okay. They can do that. That's the way that the system is set up. So we create this system of checks and balances. Now, what the Constitution did was it set up a very large republic, something that, according to political theory of the day, could not survive. In the 10th Federalist Paper, these Federalist Papers that I mentioned earlier, Madison turned this theory on his head, claiming that a republic in a large area had a better chance of preserving liberty than one in a small area. For Madison, factions were the key problem in sustaining a republic. In a democracy, a majority faction or a group willing to ride roughshod over the rights of others to ensure its own interests could easily gain control and destroy liberty. Such factions cannot be abolished without abolishing liberty, but they must also be controlled by checks and balances. Now, a large republic can do this better than small ones because the greater population and area resulted in more factions and a reduced chance that one would dominate. So Madison feared that if you have a democracy and everyone voted, a faction would appear, a majority would appear. And the problem is that once that majority takes too much control, then they have all the power and nothing changes. So Madison said we need lots of factions. We need lots of them. We need like 12 political parties because that would reduce the amount of a democratic takeover by one group. Now, do we have 12 political parties today? What do you guys think? Do we have 12 political parties? Easy yes or no. 12 political parties? No. Thank you, Marcia. We have, how many do we have? We have two political parties. So if we think about what Madison and what the founding fathers wanted, so first, they didn't want a democracy, and we have a democracy. They didn't want people to make too many decisions on their own, and now people are making decisions. And they thought that the best way for this to form is to have lots of factions, and today we have two. So already, we're today off to a pretty rocky start, right? We're not really following the rules as our founding fathers laid out, but that's okay, because things can change. Now, despite agreement on certain essentials, disagreements among the delegates almost wrecked the convention. Major disputes pitted delegates, so large states against small ones over the issue of representation and northern states against southern on some issues related to slavery. Delegates also were also split over just how much power to give the national government at the expense of the states. So whether or not the federal government should supersede the state all the time, or should they be kind of balanced and more equal, as Marcia asked earlier. So should each state be equal to the federal government, or should federal government have more power than each state combined? These were kind of the questions that they had to ask. Some delegates fear that despite the checks and balances, the new national government would have too much power. And only 39 of the 55 delegates signed the final document. The Constitution also called for special state ratifying conventions, with the ratification by 9 states required to put the document into effect. Intense opposition emerged in virtually every state, primarily from established groups who controlled state governments and feared centralized power. Now, the pro-Constitution forces won the struggle for a number of reasons. First, they were better organized, they were on the offensive, and they had the advantage of defining themselves as federalists, while the opponents were labeled anti-federalists. The ratification process also bypassed state legislatures that had a vested interest in the failure of the new system. So they created these new constitutional convention assemblies, if you will, and they bypassed the state legislators, which probably wanted to keep it the way they wanted to keep states more powerful, but this bypassed them. Further, the Federalists also agreed to address a key anti-federalist objection: the lack of a specific Bill of Rights. Creating one would be the first order of business under the new government. And I recommend everyone going online and reading the first 10 amendments to our Constitution, which was the original Bill of Rights. I already mentioned one amendment, Amendment 10, and there's others as well that are very important for you to understand for the purpose of this class, and I will be reviewing those a little bit later. Now, the final version of the Constitution and the Federalist Papers show the founders as Hobbesian realists who distrusted human nature and sought to stop what they considered the excesses of revolution. And in that sense, they can be viewed as conservative, even counter-revolutionary. Simultaneously, however, they were still Lockeans after the philosopher John Locke, and revolutionaries who wanted to preserve their Republican experiment against what they considered clear and present dangers, and were willing to try a radical and unprecedented experiment to do so. The founders succeeded in establishing a new frame of government, but in the process, they left a series of unanswered questions that would cause a split among them within a few years and would be bequeathed to their successors, ourselves. So, some questions we might ask ourselves before we go today, and I'll also be posting a couple other videos on the Electoral College that was created by our founding fathers. Why do we equate liberty with democracy when the writers of the Constitution did not do so? And this is something very important, because we often say that the founding fathers wanted this. This is what the founding fathers said. They wanted this, they wanted that, right? But in this lecture, we've learned that there were actually some things that our founding fathers wanted that we didn't do. We completely changed, and we're completely doing something different today. And we may ask ourselves, why do we tend to project our contemporary values onto the past? And this is something we call this, in history, we call this presentism, where we take our present views and we try to say, this must have been what they thought because it's what we think today. And we know that liberty doesn't necessarily mean democracy. To us, liberty is certain freedoms, certain tangible freedoms, whereas democracy is the organization of a type of government. And democracies technically don't have to give people freedoms. We actually wrote we created a democratic system that gives certain freedoms, but one did not necessarily coincide with the other. We actually had to create a Bill of Rights to create a more democratic society and to and give us more liberties that the government could not take away from us. And that's another important thing to remember when you're reading the Constitution and when you're reading the Bill of Rights. These aren't necessarily individual rights, excuse me, as we think of them today. They were actually rights that the government cannot take away from us, things that the government cannot do to prevent us from doing certain things. So that is all that I have for today. I'm gonna answer any questions you guys have before we leave today. So are there any questions about assignments coming up or any other things that we have been doing in the class? And I'm just going to say this is the end of the lecture. You guys stick around for a little bit. I'm going to stop the recording right now.